Day 4. You haven't spoken in 96 hours. Your phone sits in a locked drawer somewhere, surrendered at a folding table that feels like it belonged to a previous life. Your back burns in a slow line from hip to shoulder blade. The bell rang at 4 this morning, the way it rings every morning. The only instruction you've been given since you arrived hasn't changed. Observe. Don't react. Somewhere around the 11th hour of stillness, a thought arrives with the force of revelation. I paid nothing for this, and I would pay anything to leave. I know that wall. I've sat against it. What waits on the other side of it is the reason for this video. Three things about that retreat, and nobody tells you any of them. The movement that built it is roughly 130 years old. Its name, Vipassana, gets translated as meditation. The word points somewhere else, and when this practice finally came home to the tradition that created it, repackaged and rebranded by the West, its own heirs didn't recognize it. What is Vipassana? What is it actually for? And how did it escape the monastery, cross an ocean, and forget its own name? That story starts with the word itself. Three people at a dinner party, each of them at some point in the evening says the same sentence: I did Vipassana. The first spent 10 days in silence, sweeping her attention through her body from scalp to toes, hour after hour. The second sat for a month, silently noting every experience as it appeared, rising, falling, hearing, thinking. The third opened an app on his lunch break and was finished before his coffee cooled. Same sentence, 3 different acts, and if you asked any of them what the word itself means, the table would go quiet. I've watched a version of this conversation happen more than once, so let's do the one thing nobody at that table can do, and read the word. Vipassana is a Pali word, and it comes apart in 2 pieces. Passana means seeing, and V is a prefix that sharpens it, seeing clearly all the way through. That's the whole definition, and it changes everything because the word describes a quality of perception. Every technique that carries the name, the body sweep, the noting, even the app, exists for one purpose: to produce that quality. 2 people can practice the same technique for years and walk away with completely different depths of seeing. The tradition has always cared about the seeing, which raises an old question. Where does the calm fit in? Buddhism names a second quality alongside Vipassana: samatha, tranquility, the settled, unified mind. Modern retreat culture sometimes treats the two as rival schools. The tradition treats them as partners in a single process, and Thich Nhat Hanh described how the partnership works. Mindfulness, sustained, gathers into concentration, and concentration, grown strong enough, makes what he called a breakthrough. The breakthrough is insight. Calm is the fuel. Seeing is what the fuel is for. So Vipassana is a way of seeing, which leaves the only question that matters. Seeing what exactly? Hold an ice cube. You know it melts. You've known that since you were 4 years old. That's knowledge. A fact you carry around, filed away with everything else you've never had to look at. Now hold the ice cube and don't put it down. Watch it disappear against the heat of your own hand. The edges round off and the weight lightens. The cold turns to water and threads between your fingers. Somewhere in that minute, Ice melts, stops being a fact you carry, and becomes an event you witnessed. That gap between knowing a thing and watching it happen is the entire practice. Everything else grows from it. Vipassana trains one act, watching experience arise and pass in real time. Sensations, sounds, thoughts, moods, each one appearing and passing. The ice cube in your hand running on everything you feel. Most of what you feel behaves far more strangely than ice. At noon, someone calls you an idiot. By 1 second past noon, those words no longer exist anywhere on earth. Vibrations in the air, dispersed. 12 hours later, you're lying in the dark, rebuilding them syllable by syllable, and they're still running your night. The mind manufactures pain out of vanished phenomena. Watching that happen, live as it happens in your own head, is the practice working. Watch closely enough, the tradition says, and every object of experience reveals the same 3 features. It changes, anicca. Because it changes, it can't be leaned on. And what can't be leaned on keeps letting you down, dukkha. Because it never holds still, it can't be the solid, permanent self. It presents itself as anatta. The Buddha laid this out in the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, his discourse on not-self. And more than 2,000 years ago, he reduced the first step of it to a single sentence. All conditions are impermanent. When you see this with wisdom, you grow disillusioned with suffering. The Dhammapada, verse 277. Notice what the verse names: the act of seeing itself. We've walked through the 5 aggregates and dependent origination on this channel before. Tonight, you're watching that machinery run live. Then the chain takes its final step. I'd ask you to slow down with me here. The watching doesn't stop at the world. Stay with it long enough and the watcher itself comes into view. And the observer you assumed was the one permanent thing in the room turns out to be arising and passing like everything it observes. Buddhism asks you to look closely enough that the assumption of a solid self starts to unravel on its own. Belief never enters into it. Clinging needs a stable object to grip. Clear seeing keeps revealing there isn't one. And the grip, with nothing left to hold, starves. I can tell you from my own time on the cushion, reading about impermanence and watching it happen in your own body are 2 different events. One is a sentence, the other rearranges the furniture. This is why the retreat instruction never changes. Observe, don't react. Stillness removes every escape route, nowhere to scroll, nothing to say, and with nowhere left to go, reaction finally becomes visible. Pain reveals reaction, reaction reveals craving, and craving reveals the grip itself. Day 4 hurts because the mind is being asked to do the one thing it has spent a lifetime avoiding. Watch without editing. The pain is the curriculum. That's the seeing. It's ancient. The tradition insists it's available to anyone. So, if that is Vipassana, where did your version come from? The 10-day retreats, the body scans. For that, we go to a city most people couldn't find on a map, in the worst November of its history. That city is Mandalay. November 29, 1885. British soldiers are marching the last king of Burma out of his own palace. They load him onto a bullock cart, a farmer's cart. Most historians think that's deliberate. Let the whole city watch its king leave like cargo. He never comes back. Now, what does a dead kingdom have to do with the meditation millions of people practice today? Everything. For 1,000 years, Burmese kings have one job the textbooks rarely mention. They protect the Buddha's teaching. Royal money builds the monasteries. Royal authority convenes the councils that guard the texts. Remove the king, and the dharma loses its bodyguard. And the British, they don't attack Buddhism, they don't even think about Buddhism. They're here for teak and trade routes. They simply decline the job. No decree, no burning texts. 1,000 years of protection ends with paperwork. Watch closely. Indifference is about to become the most productive force in modern Buddhist history. Burmese monks are now asking a terrifying question. If nobody protects the teaching, how long before it dies? You'd expect meditation to be the thing that saves it. Monasteries full of meditating monks. That's the part that stopped me cold when I dug into this. For most of Buddhist history, most monks don't meditate. Robert Sharf puts it bluntly, meditation rarely played a major role in the daily life of monasteries. Deep practice belongs to a handful of forest specialists, years of training, gated behind jhana, states of absorption so deep they're getting their own episode. Your village monk teaches, chants, keeps the texts. He doesn't sit for hours watching his mind. As for lay people, farmers, forget it. Everyone knows the Dharma has entered its dying age. Liberation is off the menu until the next Buddha, Maitreya, ages from now. Sit with that. The practice you assumed was always for everyone. For centuries, it was for almost no one. The awakening you assumed it promised, nobody expected to reach it. So, a teaching with no protector, a practice almost nobody practices, a tradition bracing for extinction. Enter a monk you've never heard of, whose decision you are currently living inside. Lady Sayadaw, forest scholar, Upper Burma. He looks at the collapse and follows his own tradition's logic. When the Dharma dies, practice dies first. Texts survive in libraries. Practice survives in one place only, minds. So, where do you hide a treasure when the vault is gone? Everywhere. Ledi takes the Abhidhamma, the most technical philosophy Buddhism possesses, and rewrites it as plain Burmese verse. Farmers memorize it behind the plow. He prints it on the empire's own presses, thousands of copies. And look at what those farmers are actually doing. It's the ice cube, the same watching you met earlier, pointed at mud, heat, and a field that changes with every season. Ledi is betting that the seeing needs no monastery, only a mind willing to look. The establishment, furious. Scholars accuse him of handing surgical instruments to people who've never washed their hands. He keeps going, and his movement makes the most radical claim of all. Stream entry, Sotapanna, the first stage of awakening, is back on the table. In this life, for farmers. Liberation stops waiting for Maitreya. The historian Eric Brown in The Birth of Insight calls it excavation as much as invention. Lay awakening was in the suttas the whole time. The door had a key sitting in it for centuries. Ledi turned it. From that decision to your retreat hall, roughly 130 years, there's the first thing nobody tells you. But a door only matters if someone walks through it. And who walks through this one? A farmer, an accountant, and a businessman. That sounds like the setup to a joke. It's the actual lineage. The relay begins with grief. A cholera epidemic rips through a village in the Irrawaddy Delta. This is how the lineage tells it, and takes most of what one farmer loves. Sahya Techi. No education, no status, nothing left. He walks out of his shattered life and into Lady's orbit and practices for years. Then Ledi does something with almost no precedent behind it. He authorizes the farmer to teach. Do you feel how strange that is? A layman instructing monks in meditation. Every time I come back to this story, that authorization is the moment I stop at. The door isn't merely open anymore, a farmer is holding it. Now watch the practice jump again. One of the farmer's students works in an office and climbs. Uba Kin becomes accountant general of newly independent Burma, and he runs a meditation center a short walk from his desk. Government clerks, learning to watch sensation arise and pass between audits while the paperwork waits. That's the act from our second chapter, running in a government chair, monastery to farm to bureaucracy. 2 generations. And now, the accountant's most famous student, a wealthy Indian industrialist in Rangoon, migraine so brutal that, by his own telling, doctors offer him morphine. He walks into Uba Kin's center looking for pain relief. He walks out with something else entirely. His name is S.N. Goenka. 14 years, the businessman trains under the accountant, and within the movement, they tell of the weight Uba Kin carries through those years. A conviction that Burma has kept the dharma safe for centuries and owes it back to the land it came from. But a government post means he can never leave Burma to deliver it himself. So in 1969, the pupil goes where the teacher can't. Goenka boards a plane to India, the land his own ancestors left, carrying Buddhism's greatest export home to the country that forgot it. We told that story, how Buddhism vanished from India, in another episode. This is the moment, 8 centuries later, when it comes back through customs. His first course, Bombay, that July, a handful of students, among them, as he told it, his own mother and father. I find that detail hard to get past. A revolution that begins with an empire falling, resumes with a man teaching his parents to watch their breath. A monk trusted a farmer. The farmer trusted a civil servant. The civil servant trusted a businessman. And the businessman got on a plane, 1 ocean left, and on the other side waits something Burma never planned for, people who want the seeing without the Buddhism. Early 1970s. Young Americans, Peace Corps veterans, seekers with one-way tickets, are sitting in Indian and Burmese meditation halls, learning a practice their own culture has no word for. Within a decade, they build it an industry. Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein, Sharon Salzberg, they come home and found the Insight Meditation Society in a Massachusetts farmhouse. 2 Burmese streams merge under that roof. Goenka's, and a second one, the noting method of Mahasi Sayadaw. Rising, falling, hearing, thinking. Our second dinner guest, remember? Mahasi's movement swept Burma with the new government's money behind it. Politics, as much as merit, decided which techniques the world would meet. Goenka builds something stranger, identical 10-day courses on every continent. The same recorded instructions in every hall, the founder on videotape, teaching students he'll never meet, in countries he'll never visit, no charge. The courses run on donations from students who've already finished one. 10 days, no books, no phone. You won't even make eye contact with the person beside you. Up at 4 in the morning, sitting until 9 at night. And for the first 3 days, nothing but the breath. Then day 4 arrives, and in Goenka's system, that's when Vipassana itself is taught. The object changes. The instruction? Exactly what it was on day 1. Observe. Don't react. The pain and the practice hit the student in the same 24 hours. Sound familiar? That's the retreat from our opening. Now you know what day 4 was doing. The wall is the curriculum meeting the student. I felt that meeting from the inside, and I can tell you, the instruction holds. Then comes 1979, and the practice sheds its last Buddhist skin. John Kabat-Zinn carries the technique into a hospital in Worcester, Massachusetts, and renames it mindfulness-based stress reduction. The word Buddhism leaves the room. A hospital can prescribe stress reduction. It cannot prescribe liberation. The practice takes the shape of the container it enters. And why could this practice be stripped so cleanly? It demands no ritual and no deity, and nobody asks you to convert. Goenka himself spent years framing it as non-sectarian, universal, open to any religion. The stripping began in Asia, in the tradition's own hands. Science validates what it can measure. Attention sharpens, stress drops. And in validating the fuel, it loses track of the seeing. Something real was gained. Millions reached who'd never walk into a temple. Something real was lost. A practice built to dismantle the self, redeployed to help the self perform. Both are true. I'll let them share the room. And that's how one locked door became 5. Say I did Vipassana today, and you mean one of at least 5 different things. Goenka's body sweep, Mahasi's noting, the American retreat style, Pa-Auk's jhana first path, or a clinical protocol with no Buddha in it anywhere. The people who built those 5 never fully agreed with each other. There is no official Vipassana, there's a family, and like most families, it argues. But strip away the schedules and the techniques, and all 5 point at one act. Watching experience arise and pass. 5 doors, 1 room. And when the practice finally travels home, that's where the story turns strange. A dinner in Bhutan, one of the most deeply Buddhist countries on earth. Around the table, Bhutanese elites freshly back from a 10-day Goenka retreat, visibly moved, and they turn to one of their own tradition's most respected teachers and ask, in complete sincerity, "Don't we have something like that in Buddhism?" Dzongtsar Khyentse Rinpoche later admitted the question depressed him for weeks. There's the third thing nobody tells you, playing out at a dinner table. Burma exported this practice to save the dharma from extinction. A century later, it comes home so repackaged, so thoroughly translated, that its own heirs can't see their inheritance sitting in front of them. The Rinpoche's diagnosis, the problem is the words themselves. Meditation translates the Tibetan gom, which means familiarization. Getting used to something, the way you get used to driving a car. And Vipassana translates lak tong, seeing the true color of things, the real condition behind the surface. Which is why he can say with a completely straight face that circumambulating a stupa, or printing a prayer flag, is Vipassana. The seeing is the point. Sitting was only ever one way in. One lama's eccentricity. Thich Nhat Hanh said the same thing about washing dishes. From the opposite end of the Buddhist world, the tradition keeps saying it. The West keeps hearing, sit still. And one irony sits buried in the revolution itself. It cuts deepest of all. Lady Sayadaw, the man who opened the door, insisted relentlessly, in text after text, on concentration and the full path. Ethics, stillness, and wisdom developed together. The father of the lay insight revolution would very likely side with today's critics of what walked through his door. But measure him by the standard he chose, plant the teaching in ordinary minds before the institutions fall. By that measure, the gamble succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined. Somewhere tonight, someone is sitting in a silent hall, knees burning, wanting to quit. If you've ever sat through a day 4 of your own, you know exactly where they are. They have no idea the form they're struggling through is younger than the light bulb, or that the seeing it points toward is the oldest thing in Buddhism. The king whose fall started all of this never came back, and tonight his teaching is practiced in more countries than his conquerors ever ruled. If for one moment that person in the hall stops reacting and simply watches, they touch exactly what the Buddha pointed at 2,500 years ago. The insight is ancient. The movement is modern. And seeing that difference clearly, seeing the thing as it actually is where Vipassana begins. The other half of this story is still locked. Everyone learned the seeing, almost nobody learned the stillness the Buddha paired with it. The 4 states he was resting in on the night of his awakening. That practice came close to disappearing entirely. And the argument over it, whether insight without deep concentration is even possible, is the most heated debate in Theravada Buddhism today. That's the next episode. Until then, our Theravada video and dependent origination are the foundations under everything you watch tonight, both linked below. Tell me in the comments which version of Vipassana you met first. And until next time, stay curious, stay wise,